The car had barely stopped moving when the front doors of Ravenscourt House were pulled open from the inside, and Eleanor stepped out onto the stone steps with her hands folded in front of her, already smiling, before she knew what she would see. She had been waiting 3 days for this moment. Alistair had sent only a short message saying he was coming home, nothing more, no details, no warning of what he would bring with him. She had imagined a dozen versions of this morning. None of them included what she saw now. Alistair stepped out of the car first, his coat still buttoned despite the warm afternoon, his face brighter than she remembered it in years. He turned back toward the open door and reached out a hand. A young woman took it, stepped down onto the gravel, and looked up at the house as though she were memorizing every window. Eleanor did not move. She kept her hands folded and her spine straight, and she watched her husband walk toward her with another woman on his arm, both of them smiling like they had won something. "Eleanor," Alistair said, his voice light, almost cheerful, the way a man speaks when he has convinced himself that nothing is wrong. "This is Celine. I wanted you to meet her properly." Celine offered a small nod, not quite a bow, not quite a greeting between equals. She wore a green traveling coat that had clearly cost more than most of the staff earned in a season, and she held herself the way a woman does when she has been told, many times, that she is beautiful enough to get away with anything. "Welcome to Ravenscourt," Eleanor said, and her voice did not shake. "You must be tired from the road. I'll have tea brought to the drawing room." For a moment, nobody spoke. Somewhere behind Eleanor, she heard the soft intake of breath from Mrs. Abbott, the housekeeper, who had come out onto the steps with a tray in her hands and now stood frozen, unsure whether to retreat or continue forward. Alistair blinked. He had expected something. Tears, perhaps, a raised voice, a door slammed somewhere in the house. He had rehearsed, in the quiet hours of the journey home, 3 different ways to calm his wife down, 3 different explanations he could give if she demanded one. He had not rehearsed for calm tea and a warm welcome. "Tea," he repeated, as though the word itself confused him. Yes, that would be lovely. Eleanor turned and walked back into the house first, and the small group followed her. Alistair a step behind Celine, Celine 2 steps behind Eleanor, and behind all of them, the staff exchanged glances that carried entire conversations, without a single word spoken aloud. The drawing room at Ravenscourt had tall windows that faced the garden, and in the afternoon light, it looked exactly as it always had, warm and orderly, with fresh flowers on the low table and the good china already set out, as though Eleanor had known exactly how many cups she would need. She had known. She always knew. "Please, sit," Eleanor said, gesturing to the long sofa near the window. Celine sat first, arranging her coat around her knees, glancing sideways at Alistair, as though checking that she was doing this correctly. Alistair sat beside her, a little too close, a little too deliberately close, as if proximity alone could prove something to the room. Eleanor sat in the chair across from them, the one that had always been hers, the one with the small worn patch on the arm, where she rested her hand while reading in the evenings. She poured the tea herself, without asking Mrs. Abbott to do it, and handed the first cup to Celine. "Milk or sugar?" Eleanor asked. Celine hesitated, clearly having expected hostility rather than hospitality, and it took her a moment to answer. "Just milk." "Thank you." "How was your journey?" Eleanor asked, pouring a second cup for Alistair, who watched her hands as though trying to read something hidden in the way she moved. "Long," Alistair said. "We came through the coast towns. Celine had never seen the sea before." "How lovely," Eleanor said, and there was nothing in her voice to suggest she found it anything but lovely. Nothing to suggest that she had spent 8 months alone in this house, while her husband taught another woman to love the coastline they had once walked together. Years ago, before everything. Celine sipped her tea and looked around the room, taking in the paintings on the walls, the tall bookshelves, the fireplace with its carved mantel, and something in her expression shifted, a kind of quiet calculation, as though she were adding up the value of the room and deciding it suited her. "This house is beautiful," Celine said. "Alistair told me so much about it, but I didn't expect it to be this grand." "It has been in the family for 4 generations," Eleanor said. "My husband's grandfather built the East Wing. I hope you'll feel comfortable here for as long as you're staying." The word staying hung in the air a moment longer than it should have. Alistair shifted slightly on the sofa, He had not, in fact, told Eleanor how long Celine would be staying, because he had not yet decided how to say what he meant, which was that he did not intend for Celine to leave at all. About that, Alistair began, clearing his throat, sitting forward with his elbows on his knees, in the manner of a man about to deliver news he has rehearsed, but still finds difficult to say aloud. Eleanor, I think we should talk. Properly. Just the two of us, perhaps, later this evening. Of course, Eleanor said, as though he had suggested nothing more significant than discussing the week's menu. Whenever you're ready. There's no rush. No rush. The words seemed to unsettle him more than any accusation could have. He had come home prepared for a fight, prepared to defend himself, prepared even to raise his voice if it came to that, because in his mind, a woman who discovered her husband had brought his companion into her home had every right to be furious, and he had built his courage around absorbing that fury and standing firm regardless. He had not built any courage around this. Her stillness felt, somehow, more dangerous than shouting would have. Mrs. Abbott appeared in the doorway, wringing her hands slightly before she spoke. Your Grace, shall I have the blue room prepared for the guest? Eleanor did not hesitate. Yes, please, and see that fresh flowers are put in it. Miss Celine will want to feel welcome. Right away, Your Grace, Mrs. Abbott said, though her eyes lingered on Eleanor a moment longer, searching for some sign, some flicker of the anger that surely must be hiding beneath that composed face. She found nothing, and she left the room with the particular walk of a servant who has just witnessed something she does not fully understand and will be discussing in the kitchen within the hour. Celine finished her tea and set the cup down with a small, satisfied clink. You're very gracious, she said to Eleanor, in a tone that carried the faintest edge of surprise, as though graciousness were the last thing she had expected to receive. I try to be a good hostess, Eleanor said, whatever else may be true. The sentence was simple enough that Alistair could have let it pass, but something in the phrasing made him glance at his wife more carefully, the way a man looks twice at a door he thought was locked. Whatever else may be true. He did not know what she meant by it, and he did not ask, because asking would mean opening a conversation he was not yet ready to have. The afternoon moved on in careful, polite fragments. Eleanor asked about the towns they had visited. Celine described a market in a coastal village, a small shop that sold hand-painted tiles, a night when the stars had been so bright they could see them reflected on the water. Alistair added details here and there, watching his wife's face for any crack in her composure, finding none. When the tea was finished, Eleanor rose. I imagine you'd both like to rest before dinner. Mrs. Abbott will show Celine to her room. Alistair, perhaps you'd like to freshen up as well. We'll have dinner at 8, as usual. As usual, Alistair repeated, almost to himself, and there was something in his voice that suggested the phrase struck him differently than he expected, a small unease creeping in where confidence had been sitting comfortably only moments before. Eleanor left the drawing room first, walking down the long hallway toward her study, the one room in the house that had always, by unspoken agreement, belonged entirely to her. She closed the door behind her and stood for a moment with her back against it, and only then, alone, did her shoulders drop the smallest amount, just enough to release some of the effort it had taken to hold herself so still for the last half hour. She crossed to her desk and opened the bottom drawer, the one that locked with a small brass key she kept on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her collar where no one would think to look. Inside were folders, neatly labeled, containing bank statements, letters, receipts, and copies of documents she had spent the better part of a year collecting. Quietly, patiently, while her husband believed she suspected nothing. She had suspected everything. She had known for a long time. She did not open the folders now. There would be time for that later, this evening, after dinner, after the house had settled into its evening quiet. For now she simply looked at them, confirming they were still there, still exactly as she had left them, and then she closed the drawer and locked it again. Outside her study window, she could see the garden path where, years ago, she and Alistair had walked together on the evening he proposed, both of them young and certain that whatever came next would be simple, because they loved each other. She remembered that evening clearly, the particular gold of the light, the way he had knelt without any of the practiced grace he had learned since, stumbling over his own words because he meant every one of them. She wondered, briefly, whether that man still existed somewhere inside the one who had just walked into her home with another woman on his arm, smiling as though he had done nothing that required an apology. She decided it did not matter. Whether he still existed or not, she was no longer interested in searching for him. There was a soft knock at the study door, and Eleanor straightened before answering. "Come in." It was Mrs. Abbott again, looking uncertain, closing the door quietly behind her before speaking. "Your Grace, forgive me, but I had to ask. Are you quite all right?" Eleanor considered the question honestly before answering, because Mrs. Abbott had been with the family for nearly 20 years, and she deserved something more than a polite deflection. "I am better than all right, Mrs. Abbott. I know this looks strange to you. I know it must look as though I have lost my senses, welcoming that woman into this house with tea and kindness. But I promise you, I have not lost anything at all." Mrs. Abbott studied her for a long moment, the way she used to study Eleanor as a young bride, unsure at first what kind of mistress she would become, and then, over the years, coming to trust her completely.
"You have a plan," Mrs. Abbott said quietly. It was not a question.
"I have had a plan for quite some time," Eleanor said, "and today, it began." Mrs. Abbott did not ask for more detail, because she understood, as she always had, that Eleanor would share what needed to be shared, and nothing more, until the moment was right. Instead, she simply nodded and said, "The blue room is being prepared. Will there be anything special for dinner?" "Nothing special," Eleanor said. "Just our usual excellent cooking. Let's not give anyone reason to think anything is out of the ordinary." Mrs. Abbott allowed herself a small, tight smile before leaving the room, and Eleanor turned back to the window, watching the last of the afternoon light stretch long shadows across the garden. Upstairs, in the blue room, Celine ran her fingers along the edge of a carved wooden wardrobe and turned to Alistair, who stood near the window with his hands in his pockets, staring out at the grounds without really seeing them. "She's not what I expected," Celine said. "What did you expect?" Alistair asked, though his mind was elsewhere, replaying the tea in the drawing room, searching for the moment when he should have felt relief, and instead, had felt something closer to a warning. Tears, shouting. "Perhaps a scene," Celine said, sitting on the edge of the bed and smoothing the blanket beneath her hands. Instead, she poured me tea and asked about the coast towns. "She's always been composed," Alistair said, though even as he said it, he wondered if composed was really the right word for what he had witnessed. Composed suggested effort, restraint, a woman holding back a storm. What he had seen in Eleanor's face was something quieter than that, something that unsettled him precisely because it did not look like restraint at all. It looked like certainty. "I suppose that's a good thing," Celine said, though her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced. "It would be easier, wouldn't it, if she simply accepted things as they are?" Alistair did not answer right away. He was thinking about the phrase Eleanor had used, "whatever else may be true," and the way she had smiled while saying it, a smile that did not reach the same place in her eyes that it used to, back when her smiles had been simple and easy and entirely for him. "Yes," he said finally, though the word came out less certain than he intended. "It would be easier." Downstairs, in the kitchen, Mrs. Abbott stood near the stove speaking in low tones with Mr. Grant, the butler, who had served the family even longer than she had. "She poured the tea herself," Mrs. Abbott said. "Didn't even let me do it." "And you say she seemed calm," Mr. Grant said, not quite a question. "Calm as still water," Mrs. Abbott said. "But you know as well as I do, Grant, still water can hide a great deal underneath." Mr. Grant nodded slowly, polishing a piece of silverware that did not need polishing, his mind clearly elsewhere. "The Duchess is no fool. Whatever she's planning, I suspect His Grace will regret not asking more questions before he brought that young woman through our front door." "I suspect you're right," Mrs. Abbott said, setting a pot on the stove with more force than was strictly necessary. "Dinner at 8, nothing special," she said. "But I have a feeling this evening will be anything but ordinary." By the time the sun began to lower fully behind the hills beyond Ravenscourt, the house had settled into the particular hush that came before an important meal, the sound of footsteps on staircases, the soft clink of glasses being set on the long dining table, the smell of roasting meat drifting from the kitchen down the hallway. Eleanor changed into a deep blue dress, simple but well made, the kind of dress that did not announce itself, but commanded attention regardless. She stood before her mirror for a long moment, studying her own reflection, not searching for signs of grief or anger, but confirming that she looked exactly the way she intended to look: steady, gracious, and entirely unbothered. She thought of the folders locked in her desk drawer. She thought of the conversations she had already had, quietly, over the past several months, with a solicitor in the city, and with her brother, a barrister whose sharp mind she had always relied on more than she let anyone know. She thought of the documents she had already begun preparing, the ones that would, in time, change everything about the balance of power inside this house. None of that would happen tonight. Tonight was simply the beginning, the first quiet step in a plan that had taken nearly a year to build, and would take a bit more patience yet to complete. She left her room and walked toward the dining hall, passing the tall portraits of Alistair's ancestors that lined the corridor, men and women who had built and protected this house through generations, who had faced their own scandals and survived them in their own ways. She paused, briefly, in front of the portrait of Alistair's grandmother, a woman known in family stories for her sharp tongue and sharper mind, and Eleanor allowed herself a small private smile before continuing on toward the dining hall, where her husband and his lover were already waiting at the table, unaware that the woman walking toward them held, quite literally, the keys to everything they believed they had already won. Dinner began exactly as Eleanor intended it to begin, quietly, politely, with nothing to suggest that anything unusual had happened in this house at all. The long table had been set with the good silver, and candles burned steadily down its center, casting a warm light over the three-place settings: Eleanor at one end, Alistair at the other, and Celine seated along the side, close enough to Alistair that their hands nearly touched whenever he reached for his glass. "The soup is wonderful," Celine said, breaking a silence that had stretched a little too long. "Did you make it yourself, Your Grace?" "Our cook, Mrs. Palmer, deserves the credit," Eleanor said. "She has been with us for many years. I simply choose the menu." "You have excellent taste, then," Celine said, and Alistair glanced up sharply, as though the compliment carried more weight than it should have, though Celine had meant nothing by it beyond simple politeness. The conversation continued in this manner through the first course and into the second, small and safe, touching on the weather, the garden, a concert Celine had once attended, in a city Eleanor had never visited. Alistair spoke little, mostly watching, mostly listening, mostly trying to understand why the evening felt so different from anything he had imagined during the long journey home. He had pictured tension. He had pictured Eleanor's voice rising, her hand trembling around a wineglass, perhaps even tears, that he would have to sit through uncomfortably, before offering some explanation that would satisfy no one, least of all himself. Instead, his wife sat at the far end of the table, calm and lovely in her blue dress, asking Celine thoughtful questions about her travels, as though she were entertaining an old friend, rather than the woman her husband had brought home in her place. It was Alistair, in the end, who could not bear the calm any longer. "Eleanor," he said, setting down his fork with more force than necessary, drawing both women's attention. "I think we should speak plainly. I know this situation is unusual. I know it must be difficult for you. I would rather address it directly than pretend through an entire dinner that nothing has changed." Eleanor set down her own fork, folding her hands neatly in her lap, and looked at him with an expression of patient interest, as though he had merely suggested discussing the weather rather than the collapse of their marriage. "Of course, Alistair. What would you like to say?" He hesitated. He had rehearsed this moment many times on the journey home, had built entire speeches in his mind, explanations about loneliness and distance, and feelings that had grown slowly over many months, until he could no longer ignore them. But sitting here now, facing his wife's steady gaze, every rehearsed word seemed to scatter, leaving him with nothing but the bare truth, unadorned. "I care for Celine," he said finally, deeply. "I did not plan for this to happen, but it has happened, and I cannot pretend otherwise. I would like her to remain here, at Ravenscourt, for as long as she wishes. I understand that this is not a traditional arrangement, but I hope, in time, you might come to accept it." Celine's hands tightened slightly around the stem of her glass, watching Eleanor's face for a reaction, any reaction, that would tell her how this moment would unfold. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the silence itself began to feel heavier than any words could have. Then she smiled, small and composed, and said, "I have already told Mrs. Abbott to prepare the blue room properly for a longer stay. I imagined this conversation was coming, Alistair. You needn't have worried so much about saying it. Alistair blinked, caught off guard by the response, unsure whether relief or suspicion was the more appropriate reaction. You're not upset? I did not say that, Eleanor said, her tone still gentle, still perfectly composed. I simply said I am not surprised. There is a difference between the two, though I understand why you might confuse them. Celine glanced between husband and wife, sensing something moving beneath the surface of the conversation that she could not quite name, some current she was not equipped to read. She had expected, based on everything Alistair had told her during their months together, that Eleanor would be either a broken woman easily managed or a furious one easily dismissed. She had not expected this third possibility, a woman who seemed to be observing the entire situation from some higher vantage point neither of them could see. I appreciate your understanding, Alistair said, though the words came out less confident than he intended, as though he sensed the ground beneath him was not quite as solid as it had appeared a moment ago. There is one matter I would like to discuss, while we are being direct with one another, Eleanor said, and something in her tone shifted slightly. Still pleasant, still calm, but carrying now a note of practical business that made Alistair sit up a little straighter. The estate accounts, Mr. Colton, our solicitor, has been asking about several documents that need updating before the end of the season. Nothing complicated, simply routine matters that have gone unattended while you were away. Alistair relaxed slightly, relieved by the mundane nature of the topic after the emotional weight of the previous minutes. Of course, whatever needs signing, I'll see to it. You know I've never had patience for those details, Eleanor. You handle them so much better than I ever could. I have always tried my best, Eleanor said, and there was something almost fond in the way she said it. A warmth that did not match the coldness Alistair might have expected, given everything else happening around them. I'll have Mr. Colton send the papers over in the coming days. Nothing urgent. We can review them together whenever it suits you. That sounds fine, Alistair said, already reaching for his wine glass again, his mind already moving past the topic entirely, back toward the more immediate comfort of Celine's presence beside him, the warmth of her hand finding his beneath the table. Eleanor watched this small exchange without any visible reaction, though inside, something settled into place with quiet satisfaction. The first thread of her plan had just been laid, so gently, so naturally, that Alistair had not even noticed it happening. He had agreed, without hesitation, to sign whatever documents she placed in front of him. He had said it himself, in front of witnesses, at this very table. He trusted her with these details because he always had, because in all their years of marriage, she had never once given him reason to doubt her judgment in matters of business, and he was not about to start doubting her now, distracted as he was by his new companion and the comfortable belief that his wife posed no threat to anything he wanted. He was wrong, though it would take him some time yet to understand exactly how wrong he was. The remainder of dinner passed in lighter conversation, Celine describing a painter she had once met, Alistair recounting an old story about a hunting trip he had taken as a young man, a story Eleanor had heard many times before but listened to now as though hearing it fresh, nodding at the appropriate moments, smiling at the parts meant to be humorous. When the meal finally ended, Eleanor rose first, as she always did, signaling the close of the evening. I think I'll retire early tonight. It has been a long day for all of us. Celine, I hope you sleep well in the blue room. If you need anything at all, simply ring for Mrs. Abbott. Thank you, Celine said, and for the first time that evening, something like genuine warmth entered her voice. A small crack in the careful composure she had maintained since arriving. You've been very kind to me. I know this must be strange for you. Eleanor paused at the doorway and looked back at the two of them, husband and lover seated together at the long table, where Eleanor herself had once sat as a young bride, full of hope for a future that had, in the end, turned out very differently than she imagined. Strange is one word for it, Eleanor said, her voice still gentle, still without any edge of accusation. But I find that most difficult situations become manageable once you understand exactly what you are dealing with. I understand quite well what I am dealing with, Celine. I hope, in time, you will understand it too. She left the dining hall before either of them could respond, her footsteps light and steady on the polished floor, and behind her, in the warm candlelight, Alistair turned to Celine with a small, relieved laugh. You see, he said, I told you she would come around eventually. She has always been reasonable." Celine did not laugh with him. She was still looking toward the empty doorway where Eleanor had disappeared, replaying the woman's final words in her mind, searching for the meaning hidden somewhere beneath their calm surface, and finding, the longer she searched, that she could not shake a small, persistent feeling of unease. Later that night, long after the house had gone quiet and the candles in the dining hall had been extinguished, Eleanor sat alone in her study, with the lamp turned low, a single folder open on the desk before her. Inside were copies of bank transfers stretching back nearly a year, each one carefully documented, each one showing money moving from the family accounts into accounts she did not recognize, accounts that, after months of careful investigation, she had traced back to Celine. She had known about the affair long before Alistair left on his supposed business trip 8 months ago. She had known, in fact, almost from the beginning, though she had said nothing, had shown nothing, had continued playing the role of devoted wife, while quietly building a case that would, eventually, give her something far more valuable than a confrontation could ever provide. There was a soft knock at the door, and her brother Edmund stepped inside without waiting for an answer, closing the door quietly behind him. He had arrived that afternoon, before Alistair's return, and had remained discreetly in the guest cottage at the edge of the property, waiting for Eleanor's signal. "How did it go?" Edmund asked, settling into the chair across from her desk, his sharp eyes taking in the open folder immediately. "Better than I expected," Eleanor said. He agreed, without any hesitation, to sign whatever documents I place in front of him. He said, in front of both his lover and myself, that he trusts me completely with these matters. Edmund allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, the same smile he had worn as a boy, whenever a plan he had spent weeks constructing finally began to unfold exactly as intended. "Then it begins tomorrow. I'll have Colton draft the first document tonight. Something simple, something he won't think twice about signing." "Something simple," Eleanor agreed, closing the folder gently and setting her hand on top of it, as though sealing a promise. "But not something small, Edmund. Not really. Just something that looks small enough for him not to notice what it actually does." Edmund nodded, understanding perfectly, because this had been their plan for months now, built carefully in secret meetings with the family solicitor, refined through countless late-night conversations that Alistair had never once suspected were taking place, hidden entirely from a husband, too absorbed in his own affairs to wonder what his wife might be doing with her quiet, careful days. "He has no idea what's coming," Edmund said. "No," Eleanor agreed, and for the first time since Alistair had walked through the front door that afternoon, with another woman on his arm, something like real emotion crossed her face. Not sadness, not anger, but something colder and more determined than either. "He has no idea at all, and that is exactly how I intend to keep it, for as long as I possibly can." Outside the study window, the moon had risen high over Ravenscourt, casting silver light across the garden path where, so many years ago, a much younger Alistair had knelt in the grass and promised Eleanor a lifetime of devotion. The garden looked the same as it always had, but the woman watching it from the study window was no longer the same woman who had once believed every word of that long-ago promise. And by the time Alistair understood how much had changed, it would already be far too late for him to do anything about it. 3 days after Alistair's return, Mr. Colton arrived at Ravenscourt, carrying a leather case filled with papers, and Eleanor received him in her study with the same calm efficiency she brought to every task in the house. "Good morning, Your Grace," Colton said, setting his case on the desk and opening it to reveal neat stacks of documents, each one bound with a small paperclip and labeled in his careful handwriting. "I've prepared everything we discussed. The trust reassignment is on top, followed by the routine account updates, exactly as you requested." "Thank you, Mr. Colton," Eleanor said, glancing through the papers with the practiced eye of a woman who had spent the last year learning far more about estate law than she had ever expected to need. "And the language, as we discussed?" "Precisely as discussed," Colton said. "The document appears, on its surface, to be a simple administrative update to the joint trust, adjusting signing authority for routine transactions. Anyone reading it quickly would assume it changes very little. In fact, it transfers primary controlling authority over the trust to you alone, requiring your signature for any transaction above a modest threshold, and reduces His Grace's authority to a secondary, advisory role." Eleanor nodded slowly, running her finger down the page until she found the clause Colton described, buried carefully within several paragraphs of standard legal language that would mean little to anyone not looking for it specifically. And he wouldn't notice this unless he read very closely. Unless he read very closely and understood the significance of the specific terms used, Colton said. In my experience, His Grace has never taken much interest in the fine details of these documents. He has always trusted your judgment in these matters, has he not? He has, Eleanor said, for as long as we have been married. It has always been easier for him to sign what I place in front of him than to spend an afternoon reviewing figures he finds tedious. Then I expect this will go smoothly, Colton said, closing his case and preparing to leave. Simply have him sign at the marked page. I'll return within the week to file it properly with the court. After Colton departed, Eleanor found Alistair in the small library at the end of the east wing, seated near the window with a newspaper he was not really reading, his mind clearly elsewhere, likely with Celine, who had spent the morning exploring the gardens under Mrs. Abbott's polite but watchful supervision. Alistair, Eleanor said, stepping into the room with the folder from Colton's visit tucked beneath her arm. Mr. Colton came by this morning. There are some routine papers that need your signature before he can file them properly. Alistair looked up, setting the newspaper aside with visible relief, grateful for any distraction from his own restless thoughts. Of course. What are we signing today? Nothing exciting, I'm afraid, Eleanor said, setting the folder on the small table beside him and opening it to the marked page, exactly as Colton had instructed. Just an update to the trust administration, adjusting some of the routine signing procedures, and a few account updates that have been waiting since before you left. Alistair glanced at the document, his eyes moving quickly across the dense paragraphs of legal language without really absorbing any of it, the way he had signed hundreds of similar documents over the years, trusting entirely that Eleanor would never place anything before him that was not exactly what she claimed it to be. You always understand these things so much better than I do, he said, reaching for the pen Eleanor had already placed beside the paper. I don't know why we even keep pretending I need to look them over. You could simply sign for me and save us both the trouble. I would never presume to sign in your name, Eleanor said, watching him steadily as he positioned the pen above the marked line. Your signature matters, Alistair. It always will. He laughed softly at this, missing entirely the weight beneath her words, the quiet truth she was speaking, that had nothing to do with the sentiment he assumed she meant. His signature mattered a great deal, more than he could possibly understand in this moment, because it was his own hand, his own careless trust, that was about to hand her the very tools she needed to reclaim everything he believed he still controlled. He signed his name at the bottom of the page, the same signature he had used for 20 years, quick and confident, and set the pen down without a second thought. There. Was that so difficult? Not difficult at all, Eleanor said, closing the folder gently and holding it against her chest for a moment, as though sealing something precious inside. Thank you, Alistair. I'll see that Mr. Colton receives this properly. She turned to leave, and Alistair called after her, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity that had nothing to do with suspicion. Eleanor, may I ask you something? She paused at the doorway and looked back at him. Of course. You seem different since I returned, he said, choosing his words carefully, the way a man does when he senses something has shifted beneath his feet, but cannot yet identify what it is. Calmer, perhaps. I expected you to be angry with me. I still do not fully understand why you are not. Eleanor considered the question for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice was gentle, almost tender, carrying none of the coldness that might have accompanied a more honest response. Anger is a very tiring emotion, Alistair. I have found, over this past year, that there are far more productive ways to spend my time. That's a rather practical way of looking at heartbreak, Alistair said, half joking, though something in her answer had genuinely unsettled him, a feeling he could not quite name, but that lingered uncomfortably in his chest, long after she had left the room. He looked back down at the newspaper on his lap, no longer interested in its contents, his mind instead replaying the small exchange, searching for whatever it was that had felt so strange about it. He could not put his finger on it. He decided, eventually, that it did not matter, that Eleanor had simply grown into a more mature, more measured version of herself during his absence, and that this was, on balance, a good thing for both of them. He did not know, could not have known, that he had just signed away his exclusive authority over one of the family's largest financial holdings. He did not know that similar documents, carefully prepared and carefully worded, would continue arriving over the coming weeks, each one appearing routine, each one carrying, buried within its careful language, another small piece of the control he currently held. That evening, Celine found Alistair in the garden, walking slowly along the same path where Eleanor had once received his proposal so many years before, though neither of them knew this particular history as they walked it now. "You seem distracted," Celine said, slipping her arm through his. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," Alistair said, though he did not sound entirely convinced of his own answer. "Eleanor had some papers for me to sign today. Routine business matters. Nothing important." "You trust her judgment quite a lot," Celine observed, and there was something careful in the way she said it, a question hidden within the statement. "She has always managed these things well," Alistair said. "Better than I ever could. I've never had much patience for figures and legal language. Eleanor enjoys that sort of thing, believe it or not." Celine was quiet for a moment, watching the last light fade over the garden, thinking of her own upbringing, far more modest than the world she now found herself walking through, and of the ambitions that had brought her here in the first place. She had not expected, when she first met Alistair, that his wife would prove to be quite so complicated a presence in her plans. "Does it not bother you?" Celine asked carefully, "that she has so much control over the family's finances?" Alistair laughed, genuinely amused by the question. "Eleanor would never do anything to harm this family's interests. Whatever else has happened between us, I trust her completely in matters of business. She has given me no reason not to." Celine said nothing more on the subject, though privately, she found herself wondering whether Alistair's confidence was entirely well placed, or whether it was simply the comfortable blindness of a man who had never needed to question the people around him, because life had always arranged itself conveniently in his favor. She did not yet understand Eleanor well enough to know which possibility was closer to the truth. She would understand, eventually, though by the time she did, the understanding would arrive far too late to change anything at all. In her study that night, Eleanor filed the newly signed document carefully into her locked drawer, alongside the growing collection of evidence and paperwork she had assembled over the past year. She sat for a long moment, with her hand resting on top of the folder, thinking not of anger or revenge, but of patience, of the long, careful work still ahead of her, of all the small signatures still needed before her plan would be complete. Edmund arrived a short while later, letting himself in through the garden door, as he had taken to doing during his visits, careful never to be seen entering through the main entrance, where Alistair or Celine might notice him. "How did the signing go?" he asked, settling into his usual chair. "Exactly as expected," Eleanor said. "He didn't read a single line beyond the first paragraph. He trusts me completely, Edmund. It's almost sad how completely he trusts me, given everything else he's done." "Sad for him," Edmund said, "but useful for us. Colton says the next document should be ready within the week. The one adjusting authority over the business investments." "Good," Eleanor said, closing the drawer and locking it once more. "One step at a time. There's no need to rush this. I want every piece in place before he even begins to suspect what's happening." "And Celine?" Edmund asked. "How is she settling in?" Eleanor's expression shifted slightly, something thoughtful entering her eyes. "She's clever, that one. Cleverer than Alistair realizes, I think. She's already beginning to ask questions he doesn't have good answers for. It won't be long before she starts wondering exactly how secure her position here truly is." "Will that be a problem for us?" Edmund asked. "No," Eleanor said, and there was something almost like amusement in her voice now, quiet and controlled, the first genuine lightness she had allowed herself since this entire ordeal had begun. "I don't think it will be a problem at all. In fact, I suspect Celine's own ambitions may prove rather useful to me, before this is all finished." Edmund raised an eyebrow, intrigued, but Eleanor said nothing more on the subject that evening, choosing instead to turn the conversation toward more immediate matters, the timeline for the remaining documents, the careful language Colton would need to prepare for each one, the slow and steady dismantling of a trust that Alistair had never once thought to question, right up until the moment it would already be far too late for him to reclaim what he had so carelessly signed away. 2 weeks into her stay at Ravenscourt, Celine had begun to notice small things that troubled her, details she might have dismissed if they had happened only once, but that now formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. The staff addressed her politely, always politely, but never with the particular deference they showed Eleanor. When she gave instructions to Mrs. Abbott about a change in her breakfast preferences, Mrs. Abbott listened, nodded, and then, gently, mentioned that she would need to confirm the change with the Duchess first, as household matters were generally arranged through her. When Celine asked Mr. Grant to have a letter posted, he did so, but with a formal correctness that made her feel less like a member of the household and more like a guest whose stay had not yet been fully sanctioned. She mentioned none of this to Alistair at first, choosing instead to watch and wait, the same patient instinct that had served her well in every difficult situation she had navigated in her life before arriving at Ravenscourt. But as the days passed and the pattern continued, she found herself growing increasingly uneasy, and one evening, while Alistair was occupied with correspondence in his study, she sought out Eleanor directly. She found her in the garden, cutting flowers for the dining table, wearing a simple gardening apron over her dress, entirely at ease among the roses, in a way that struck Celine as somehow more genuine than anything she had witnessed from the woman so far. "May I speak with you?" Celine asked, approaching carefully. Eleanor looked up, unhurried, and gestured toward a small stone bench nearby. "Of course. Please, sit." Celine sat, smoothing her skirt, choosing her words with the same careful precision she had learned to apply to every important conversation in her life. "I've noticed that the staff seem uncertain about my place here. They're polite, but they still look to you for every decision, even small ones that concern only me." "That's a fair observation," Eleanor said, continuing to trim the roses without looking up immediately. "This has been my household for many years, Celine. The staff know their routines, and those routines have always run through me. It will take time for them to adjust to a new arrangement." "Will they adjust?" Celine asked, and there was something more direct in her voice now, a question she had clearly been building toward for some time. "Or will I always be, in their eyes, simply a guest who happens to be staying rather longer than expected?" Eleanor set down her shears and turned to look at Celine, fully for the first time since the conversation began, and something in her expression softened slightly. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of honest consideration that Celine had not expected. "I think that depends a great deal on what Alistair intends for your future here. Has he spoken to you about that?" "He has told me he wants me to stay," Celine said. "He has told me he cares for me deeply." "Those are lovely sentiments," Eleanor said. "But sentiments and arrangements are not always the same thing. Has he discussed, specifically, what your position here would be? Whether you would have any formal standing, any security, should circumstances change?" Celine hesitated, because the honest answer was no. Alistair had spoken only in vague and hopeful terms, promises of a future together, without ever quite specifying what that future would look like in practical terms, what protections it would offer her, what would happen to her if his affections shifted, as affections sometimes did, or if his family's fortunes changed in ways beyond his control. "He has not been specific," Celine admitted. "I see," Eleanor said, and there was nothing triumphant in her voice, nothing that suggested she was pleased by this admission, only a quiet, almost sympathetic understanding. "May I offer you some advice, Celine? Not as a rival, but simply as a woman who has lived rather longer in this world than you have." Celine nodded, curious despite herself, unable to fully explain why she found herself trusting the counsel of a woman she had every reason to view as an enemy. "Never rely entirely on a man's affection for your security," Eleanor said. "Affection is a wonderful thing while it lasts, but it is not, by itself, a foundation. If you intend to remain in this house, in this family, you would be wise to ask Alistair for something more concrete than promises. A formal arrangement, something in writing." Celine studied her carefully, trying to understand what motive could possibly lie behind such advice, coming as it did from the very woman whose position Celine had, in some sense, come to occupy. "Why would you tell me this?" Eleanor returned to her roses, cutting another stem with a small, precise motion. "Because I have learned, this past year, exactly what it costs a woman to place her trust entirely in someone else's hands, without securing her own position first. I would not wish that particular lesson on anyone, Celine, not even you." There was something in the way she said this last part, Not with malice, but with a kind of weary honesty that made Celine believe her, or at least believe that she meant something true by it, even if the full meaning remained hidden beneath the surface of her words. "Thank you," Celine said quietly, rising from the bench. "I'll think about what you've said." "Please do," Eleanor said, not looking up again from her flowers. "It would be a shame for you to come all this way, and give up so much, only to find yourself with nothing to show for it in the end." Celine walked back toward the house slowly, turning the conversation over in her mind, and that evening, she raised the subject with Alistair directly, choosing a quiet moment after dinner, when they sat together in the small sitting room adjoining his study. "Alistair," she said, "I've been thinking about my position here. What exactly is it, in practical terms? What would happen to me if things did not work out as we hope?" Alistair looked up from his glass, surprised by the question, though not entirely unprepared for it, since it was a question he himself had been avoiding answering, even in his own private thoughts. "What brings this on?" "I simply want to understand where I stand," Celine said. "I've given up a great deal to be here with you. I would like to know that I haven't given it up for nothing." Alistair set down his glass and reached for her hand, his expression earnest, sincere, the same expression he had worn during every promise he had made to her over the past 8 months. "Celine, I care for you deeply. I intend for you to have a place here, permanently. I simply need time to arrange things properly, given the circumstances." "What circumstances, specifically?" Celine pressed. "Eleanor and I are still married," Alistair said, somewhat uncomfortably, as though the fact embarrassed him now that it had been stated so plainly. "Any formal arrangement for you would need to wait until matters between us are properly settled, a divorce perhaps, in time. I don't want to rush into anything that might complicate our situation unnecessarily." "And how long might that take?" Celine asked. "I don't know," Alistair admitted. "These things take time, Celine. Eleanor has been surprisingly reasonable about all of this, but formal legal matters move slowly, and I don't wish to push her into anything that might upset the fragile peace we've managed to establish." Celine nodded slowly, though privately, she found herself thinking of Eleanor's words in the garden, about affection without foundation, about the particular cost of trusting entirely in someone else's hands. She said nothing further on the subject that evening, but the seed of doubt Eleanor had planted continued to grow quietly within her, taking root in ways that neither Alistair nor even Eleanor herself could fully predict. Over the following days, Celine found herself watching the household with new eyes, noticing more carefully the small signatures Alistair provided whenever Eleanor brought him documents from Mr. Colton, noticing the ease and frequency with which he signed, without truly reading. Noticing, too, the careful, deliberate way Eleanor always seemed to know exactly which papers to bring, and exactly when to bring them. She began to wonder, though she did not yet fully understand why the thought troubled her so much, whether the woman she had come to view as a defeated rival might, in fact, be building something far more significant than anyone in the house, except perhaps Eleanor herself, understood. She did not share these observations with Alistair. Something in her instinct told her that doing so would accomplish nothing, that Alistair, comfortable in his confidence and his affections, would simply dismiss her concerns, the way he seemed to dismiss every complication that did not align with the pleasant story he had constructed for himself about how his life would unfold from here. Instead, Celine began, quietly and carefully, to watch, and to wait, and to consider, for the first time since arriving at Ravenscourt, exactly what her own next move should be, should the ground beneath her prove less stable than Alistair's easy promises had led her to believe. A year before Alistair walked through the front doors of Ravenscourt with Celine on his arm, Eleanor had been sitting alone in this same study, reviewing the household accounts on an ordinary Tuesday evening, when she first noticed the discrepancy that would eventually change everything. It was a small thing, at first, a transfer of funds to an account she did not recognize, listed under a business expense category that seemed vague, even by the standards of Alistair's usual carelessness with financial detail. She might have dismissed it entirely, might have assumed it was simply another of her husband's minor indulgences, an expensive gift for a colleague, an investment in some venture he had not bothered to explain to her, if it had not been followed, the very next month, by a second transfer of similar size to the same account. She had said nothing to Alistair at first. Instead, quietly, over the following weeks, she began reviewing the accounts more carefully than she ever had before, tracing each transaction back through months of records, building a picture slowly, piece by piece, the way a person assembles a puzzle, without yet knowing what image will emerge once every piece finds its place. The picture that emerged was not a pleasant one. Regular transfers, growing steadily larger over time, all directed toward the same account, all timed suspiciously close to Alistair's increasingly frequent business trips. Trips that took him away from Ravenscourt for weeks at a stretch. Trips he described only vaguely when he returned, offering few details about the meetings he claimed to attend, or the associates he claimed to be courting. Eleanor was not a woman prone to jealousy or unfounded suspicion. She had married Alistair for love many years ago, and had spent the better part of 2 decades building a life alongside him that she had believed, right up until that ordinary Tuesday evening, to be a happy and honest one. But the numbers in front of her told a story that grew harder to ignore with each passing month, and eventually, she understood that she needed more than suspicion. She needed proof, and she needed a plan for what to do once that proof was fully assembled. She reached out to her brother Edmund first, calling him to Ravenscourt under the pretense of a family visit, and one evening, after the household had gone quiet, she showed him the records she had gathered and asked him, directly, what she should do. Edmund had studied law for many years, had built a respected practice in the city, and had always possessed a sharper mind for these matters than Eleanor herself, though she had never before needed to rely on that particular skill of his so completely. "You suspect an affair," Edmund had said, reviewing the transfers carefully, his expression grave. "I suspect something," Eleanor had answered. "I don't yet know exactly what, but I know that money has been moving out of this family's accounts for months, towards someone I have never met, and my husband has offered no honest explanation for where it goes." Edmund had been quiet for a long moment, considering the records, before finally looking up at his sister with an expression she had rarely seen from him, a mixture of anger on her behalf and careful, professional calculation.
"You have 2 choices, Eleanor. You can confront him directly, now, and see what he says.
Or you can wait, gather more proof, understand fully what you are dealing with, and position yourself to protect what is rightfully yours before he even realizes you know anything at all." Eleanor had considered both paths carefully that evening, weighing the satisfaction of an immediate confrontation against the greater security that patience might eventually provide. In the end, she had chosen patience, not because confrontation frightened her, but because she understood, even then, that a woman who confronts too early, before she fully understands her situation, often finds herself at a disadvantage she cannot easily overcome. "I want to wait," she had told Edmund. "I want to understand everything before I say a single word to him about it. And when the time comes, I want to be certain that whatever happens next, I am the one who controls how it unfolds." Edmund had agreed to help her, and over the following months, brother and sister had worked together quietly, carefully, building a case that grew more complete with each passing week. Edmund traced the mysterious account back to its owner, a young woman named Celine, working at the time in a small shop in a coastal town Alistair claimed to visit regularly for business. Eleanor learned everything she could about this woman, without ever making direct contact, understanding her circumstances, her background, her apparent ambitions, building a complete picture of the person who had become, unknowingly, the central figure in the unraveling of her marriage. She also began, during this same period, meeting privately with Mr. Colton, the family solicitor, under the careful pretense of reviewing routine estate matters, using these meetings to learn everything she could about the structure of the family trust, the business investments, the various legal mechanisms that governed how control over the family's substantial holdings could be adjusted, transferred, or restructured, and under what circumstances such changes could be made without requiring both signatures on every document. It was during one of these meetings that Colton first suggested the strategy that would eventually become the foundation of Eleanor's entire plan. The trust documents, as currently structured, require both signatures for major transactions, he had explained. But there is a mechanism, rarely used, that allows for a restructuring of signing authority through a series of smaller administrative amendments, each one requiring only routine approval rather than a full renegotiation of the trust terms. "Explain further," Eleanor had said, and Colton had spent the better part of an hour outlining, in careful detail, exactly how such a restructuring might work, how it could be accomplished gradually, through documents that appeared administrative and routine on their surface, requiring only a signature, and rarely inviting close scrutiny from a party who trusted the process implicitly. This would require your husband's cooperation, in a sense, Colton had said. Not his understanding of what he is agreeing to, but his willingness to sign what is placed in front of him without close examination. Eleanor had smiled then, a small, tired smile that carried within it 20 years of understanding exactly how little attention her husband paid to the details she managed on his behalf. That, Mr. Colton, will not be a problem at all. And so the plan had taken shape, slowly, carefully, over the months that followed, while Alistair continued his trips to the coastal town, believing his secret remained entirely his own, while Eleanor continued managing the household with the same steady competence she always had, giving no outward sign of the storm she was quietly preparing beneath the surface. When Alistair had finally left, 8 months before his return with Celine at his side, on what he had described as an extended business venture requiring his personal attention, Eleanor had understood immediately what this departure truly meant. He was not simply managing an affair from a distance any longer. He intended, finally, to bring it home. She had used those 8 months well. She had finalized every document with Colton, had reviewed every detail with Edmund, had prepared herself completely for whatever version of Alistair's return might eventually arrive at her door. When the day finally came, when she stood on the front steps of Ravenscourt and watched her husband step out of the car, with Celine's hand in his, she had felt many things, sorrow among them, a genuine grief for the marriage she had once believed in so completely. But beneath that sorrow, steady and unwavering, had been something far stronger: readiness. She had spent a year preparing for this exact moment, and she had no intention of allowing her own emotions, however genuine, to derail a plan that had taken so much patience and careful work to build. She would grieve, in time, in private, for the man she had loved and the marriage she had lost. But first, she would finish what she had started, and she would make certain that whatever came next, she would emerge from it with everything she deserved, and Alistair would emerge with only what he had truly earned. Sitting now in her study, weeks after his return, with 3 signed documents already locked safely in her desk drawer, and more still to come, Eleanor allowed herself, for just a moment, to remember the woman she had been on that ordinary Tuesday evening a year ago, discovering the first small discrepancy in the household accounts, having no idea yet how far that single thread would eventually unravel, or how completely she would need to remake herself in order to survive what came after pulling it. She had remade herself completely, and she was not yet finished. The invitation to the Harrington Gala arrived at Ravenscourt 3 weeks after Alistair's return, printed on heavy cream paper with gold lettering, exactly as it had arrived every year for the past 2 decades. It was, without question, the most important social event of the season, attended by every family of consequence within 100 miles, and Alistair saw in it an opportunity he had been waiting for since the day he brought Celine home. "We should attend together," he told Celine one morning over breakfast, his voice carrying the particular excitement of a man who has decided to make a public statement he believes will finally settle a matter he has grown tired of leaving unresolved. "It's time people understood our situation clearly, rather than relying on whatever gossip has already reached them." Celine hesitated, remembering her conversation with Eleanor, in the garden weeks earlier, the careful warning about foundations and promises. "Are you certain that's wise? Eleanor will be there as well, surely." "Of course she will," Alistair said, unconcerned, "but Eleanor has been remarkably reasonable about all of this. I see no reason why we shouldn't attend together, openly, and let people see for themselves that there is no scandal here worth whispering about, simply a private matter being handled with dignity." Celine was not entirely convinced by his confidence, but she agreed nonetheless, partly because refusing would have required an explanation she was not yet ready to give, and partly because some curious part of her wanted to see, firsthand, how Eleanor would handle such a public test of her composure. Eleanor, when informed of the plan by Alistair himself, showed no hesitation at all. "Of course," she said simply. "I'll have my dress prepared. I always enjoy the Harrington Gala." The evening of the gala arrived with a soft golden light settling over the grounds of Harrington Hall, where carriages and cars lined the long drive, and the sound of an orchestra drifted out through open windows into the warm evening air. Eleanor arrived separately from Alistair and Celine, in her own car, wearing a deep emerald gown that caught the candlelight beautifully as she stepped through the entrance. greeted immediately by old friends who had known her for decades. When Alistair arrived a short while later with Celine on his arm, a ripple of quiet attention moved through the ballroom, heads turning discreetly, conversations pausing just long enough for glances to be exchanged, before resuming at a slightly lower volume than before. Celine felt the weight of every gaze, and though she held her chin high, exactly as Alistair had coached her to do, she could feel her confidence wavering slightly beneath the collective scrutiny of a room full of strangers, who clearly already knew far more about her situation than she was comfortable with. Eleanor, meanwhile, moved through the ballroom with the easy grace of a woman entirely at home in her surroundings, greeting friends warmly, accepting compliments on her gown, dancing once with an old family friend, laughing at some remembered joke shared between them. She gave no indication, none whatsoever, that anything unusual troubled her, and this composure, more than any dramatic scene could have, became the subject of quiet fascination throughout the evening. How is she managing it? Charlotte Ashford, an old friend of Eleanor's, whispered to her husband as they watched the Duchess laugh warmly, with another guest near the refreshment table. I would be in ruins. In her position. Perhaps she simply has more strength than either of us gives her credit for, her husband replied, watching Eleanor with something like genuine admiration. Across the room, Alistair had begun to notice the same thing, and rather than the vindication he had expected to feel at finally presenting Celine publicly, he found himself instead growing increasingly uneasy as the evening progressed. Guests approached him with polite but pointed questions about his business ventures, several mentioning, with careful diplomacy, that they had heard concerning rumors about instability in the family's investments. One old associate, Mr. Whitfield, drew him aside near the terrace doors, with an expression of genuine concern. Alistair, I don't wish to intrude on personal matters, Whitfield said quietly, but several of us have grown uncertain about the upcoming venture we discussed last season. There have been whispers, you understand, about changes within your household, and investors tend to grow nervous when a family's stability appears uncertain. There's nothing unstable about my affairs, Alistair said, though his voice carried less conviction than he intended. My wife and I have reached a perfectly amicable understanding. I'm glad to hear it, Whitfield said, though his expression suggested he remained less than fully convinced. Still, you understand, investors prefer certainty. Perhaps it would be wise to reassure everyone formally, before the venture proceeds any further. Alistair returned to the ballroom troubled by this conversation, and it was not the only one of its kind he encountered that evening. By the time the orchestra began its final set, he had spoken with no fewer than 4 business associates, each expressing similar concerns, each hinting, with varying degrees of subtlety, that his personal situation had begun to affect their confidence in ventures they had previously been eager to support. Meanwhile, Eleanor had spent much of the evening in quiet conversation with several of these same associates, offering nothing beyond warm pleasantries and genuine interest in their families and their own business affairs, giving no indication whatsoever that she harbored any resentment toward her husband or any desire to see his ventures fail. And yet, somehow, her calm presence throughout the evening seemed to accomplish exactly what Alistair's public display with Celine had failed to achieve. It reassured people, quietly, that whatever difficulties existed within the Whitmore household, they had not compromised the fundamental stability and dignity of the family name. Your wife carries herself beautifully tonight, Whitfield remarked to Alistair later in the evening, watching Eleanor across the room as she laughed softly at something said by an elderly gentleman she had known for years. It speaks well of the family, that stability, even amid difficulty. Alistair said nothing in response, watching his wife with an expression he could not quite identify himself, something between admiration and unease, the growing recognition that the evening he had planned as a public declaration of his own happiness had instead become, somehow, a public demonstration of exactly how much strength and grace his wife possessed, strength he had apparently underestimated for reasons he was only now beginning to understand. Celine, standing beside him for much of the evening, had noticed the shift as well. The way conversations seemed to warm considerably whenever Eleanor was present and cool slightly when she was not. The way people's eyes lingered on Eleanor, with something like respect, while their glances toward Celine herself carried a more careful, evaluating quality, as though they were still deciding what to make of her. This isn't going the way you hoped, is it? Celine asked quietly, as they stood near the terrace doors watching the dancing continue. I'm not certain what I hoped, Alistair admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of the answer. I suppose I expected people to simply accept things as they are, once they saw us together, openly, with nothing to hide. And instead, Celine asked. Instead, Alistair said slowly, watching Eleanor across the room once more. I find myself wondering exactly what my wife has been doing, all these months I've been away, that has left her so remarkably unbothered by all of this. Celine said nothing, though privately, she found herself wondering the very same thing, and the seed of unease Eleanor had planted weeks earlier in the garden continued to grow within her, taking on new and troubling shapes as she watched the graceful, composed woman across the ballroom, clearly untouched by scandal, clearly respected by everyone present, and clearly, Celine had begun to suspect, far more dangerous than either she or Alistair had ever imagined. The gala continued late into the night, and by the time Eleanor finally departed, offering warm farewells to friends who embraced her with genuine affection, she carried with her something far more valuable than mere social approval. She carried the quiet, growing confidence of a woman who understood, with each passing hour, that her plan was working exactly as intended, that Alistair's public display had backfired in ways he could not yet fully comprehend, and that the careful foundation she had built over the past year was proving stronger and more resilient than anything her husband had constructed, with his careless promises and his equally careless choices. As her car pulled away from Harrington Hall, moving down the long drive beneath a canopy of stars, Eleanor allowed herself a small, private smile, the first genuine expression of satisfaction she had permitted herself in weeks. The evening had gone exactly as she hoped, and behind her, in the ballroom she had just left, her husband stood troubled and uncertain for the first time since his return, beginning, at last, to sense that the ground beneath him was far less stable than he had believed. The trouble that had begun quietly at the Harrington Gala arrived at Ravenscourt fully formed less than 2 weeks later, in the shape of a letter from Mr. Whitfield informing Alistair, with careful and regretful language, that he and several other investors had decided to withdraw their support from the venture they had previously discussed with such enthusiasm. Alistair read the letter twice in his study, his hands growing tighter around the paper with each pass, before finally setting it down and calling immediately for his personal secretary to arrange meetings with the remaining investors, hoping to salvage what he could before word spread any further. The meetings, when they finally happened over the following days, did not go as he hoped. One by one, the investors he had courted so carefully over the previous year expressed similar hesitations, citing concerns about the stability of the Whitmore household, concerns that had apparently grown rather than diminished since the gala, fed by whispers Alistair could not quite trace back to any single source but that seemed, somehow, to have spread through the right circles with remarkable efficiency. Frustrated and increasingly desperate, Alistair turned to the family accounts himself for the first time in months, intending to review the financial reserves available to fund the venture independently, without relying on outside investors at all. It was here, sitting alone in his study late one evening, reviewing documents he normally left entirely to Eleanor's management, that he first discovered something was deeply wrong. He found, buried within the routine paperwork he had signed weeks earlier without close examination, a clause he did not remember agreeing to, language that seemed to suggest his own authority over the family trust had been significantly reduced, that major transactions now required a signature that was not, as he had always assumed, simply a formality alongside his own, but rather the primary, controlling authority itself. He read the document 3 times, his confusion slowly giving way to a cold, creeping alarm, before finally calling for Mr. Colton to explain, in plain terms, exactly what he had signed. Colton arrived at Ravenscourt the following morning, and Alistair received him in his study, with the document spread across the desk between them, his expression carrying none of its usual easy confidence. "Explain this to me," Alistair said, pointing to the clause that had troubled him. "This suggests I no longer control major decisions regarding the trust without Eleanor's approval. That cannot be correct." Colton studied the document carefully, though he already knew, of course, exactly what it said, having drafted it himself under Eleanor's careful direction. This document, as you'll recall signing several weeks ago, restructured the trust's administrative procedures. The clause you're referring to establishes that transactions above a certain threshold now require the Duchess's approval as the primary signatory, with your own signature serving in a secondary advisory capacity. I don't recall agreeing to anything of the sort, Alistair said, his voice tightening with the particular frustration of a man realizing too late that he has been careless about something that mattered a great deal more than he understood at the time. The document was presented to you as a routine administrative update, Colton said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man who understood exactly how delicate this conversation had become. I believe the Duchess described it in those terms, and you signed accordingly. Alistair sat back in his chair, running his hands over his face, trying to remember the exact moment of that signing weeks earlier, the small library, the newspaper he had barely been reading, Eleanor's calm voice, describing the papers as nothing exciting, just an update to routine procedures. He remembered signing quickly, confidently, exactly as he always had, trusting completely that his wife would never place anything in front of him that was not precisely what she claimed it to be. He had been wrong about that trust, he now understood, in ways he was only beginning to comprehend the full scope of. There have been other documents, Alistair said slowly, more statement than question. Since my return, similar administrative updates. Several, yes, Colton confirmed, offering nothing further beyond simple factual confirmation, careful to maintain his professional distance from the deeper implications of the conversation. I need to see all of them, Alistair said. Every document I've signed since returning to Ravenscourt. I want copies, immediately. Colton nodded and departed shortly after, promising to have copies delivered within the day, and Alistair sat alone in his study for a long time afterward, staring at the single document still spread across his desk, beginning to piece together, with growing dread, exactly what his wife had been doing during these past weeks of careful, gracious hospitality. When the copies arrived that evening, Alistair reviewed each one carefully, this time reading every line with the close attention he had failed to give them the first time, and the picture that emerged, document by document, left him increasingly cold. Trust authority reassigned, business investment approvals reassigned, property management decisions, previously requiring joint approval, now requiring Eleanor's signature alone for anything beyond routine maintenance. Piece by piece, methodically, carefully, over the course of several weeks, his wife had reclaimed nearly every significant point of control he had previously held over the family's substantial holdings, and he had signed every single document himself, willingly, without complaint, believing each one to be nothing more than a minor administrative formality. He found Eleanor in the drawing room that evening, seated near the window with a book she was not really reading, and something in his expression as he entered the room made her set the book aside immediately, sensing, before he had spoken a single word, that the moment she had been carefully building toward for weeks had finally arrived. "We need to talk," Alistair said, his voice low and controlled, though the strain beneath it was unmistakable. "About the documents I've signed since I came home." "Of course," Eleanor said, folding her hands calmly in her lap, meeting his gaze without any hesitation. "What would you like to know?" "What have you done, Eleanor?" he asked, and there was something almost pleading in the question now. A man searching desperately for an explanation that might restore some sense of stability to ground that had shifted entirely beneath him without any warning. "I've done exactly what any reasonable person would do, given the circumstances," Eleanor said, her voice remaining perfectly steady, perfectly calm, carrying none of the anger he might have expected, and might, in some strange way, have found easier to face than this composed, deliberate honesty. "I discovered, over a year ago, that you were funneling money from this family's accounts into an account belonging to a woman I had never met, over the course of many months, while telling me almost nothing honest about where you traveled, or why. I did not confront you then, Alistair. Instead, I prepared. I have spent the past year, quietly and carefully, protecting this family's interests, because I understood, long before you brought Celine through our front door, that I could not continue to trust you with decisions that affect not only our future, but the future of everything this family has built across 4 generations." Alistair stared at her, the pieces finally, fully assembling themselves in his mind. "You knew, this whole time, before I even left, you knew about Celine, and you said nothing." "I knew," Eleanor confirmed, without any apology in her voice. "I chose to gather proof and prepare myself properly, rather than confront you emotionally and risk losing everything I had worked to build alongside you for 20 years. I do not regret that choice, Alistair. I regret a great many things about the past year, but I do not regret protecting myself and this family's interests from a man who had already demonstrated he was willing to deceive me for his own convenience. So this, Alistair said, gesturing at the stack of documents on the small table between them. This has all been part of some plan. Every signature, every routine paper you brought me to sign. You've been dismantling my authority over this family's holdings, piece by piece, while smiling at me over dinner and welcoming my lover into our home. Yes, Eleanor said simply, without any hesitation, without any softening of the plain, unadorned truth. That is precisely what I have been doing. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy between them, and Alistair felt, for the first time since returning home weeks earlier with such confidence and such careless certainty about how everything would unfold, the full weight of exactly how badly he had misjudged his wife, and exactly how much danger he now stood in, having signed away, one careless signature at a time, nearly everything he had once controlled. "What do you want, Eleanor?" he finally asked, his voice quiet now, stripped of its earlier confidence entirely. "What is the point of all this?" Eleanor rose from her chair and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening garden beyond, the same garden where, so many years ago, he had knelt before her with a promise he had not, in the end, managed to keep. "I want what is fair," she said finally, turning back to face him. "And I want you to understand, fully and completely, exactly what your choices have cost you. There is one more document, Alistair, the final one. When it is ready, I will bring it to you, and you will understand then exactly what I mean by fair." She left the room without waiting for his response, and Alistair remained alone in the drawing room for a long time afterward, surrounded by the documents that told the story of his own careless downfall, understanding, finally, far too late to change anything that had already been done, exactly how thoroughly his wife had outmaneuvered him, while he had been too distracted by his own selfish happiness to notice. News of the confrontation in the drawing room did not stay contained within its walls for long. Mrs. Abbott, passing by with a tray of evening refreshments she ultimately did not deliver, had heard enough through the partially closed door to understand that something significant had shifted within the household, and though she said nothing directly to the other staff, her carefully composed expression the following morning told its own story to anyone who knew her well enough to read it. Alistair spent that night in his study, rather than his bedroom, poring over every document he could find related to the family's holdings, calling his own solicitor in the city the following morning, a man entirely separate from Colton, hoping desperately to find some legal path back toward the authority he had so carelessly signed away. The news he received was not encouraging. The documents appear to have been properly executed, his solicitor explained over the telephone, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a professional delivering bad news he cannot soften. "Your signature is valid on each one." Reversing these arrangements would require either the Duchess's voluntary cooperation or a legal challenge in court, which, given the circumstances, could prove both lengthy and, I must be honest with you, uncertain in its outcome. "What circumstances do you mean specifically?" Alistair asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Your Grace," the solicitor said carefully, "any court would likely take into account the full context surrounding these signings, including, should the Duchess choose to introduce it as evidence, documentation of funds diverted from family accounts over an extended period toward an account associated with a personal relationship outside your marriage. Such evidence would not reflect favorably on your position, should this matter proceed to litigation." Alistair ended the call feeling more trapped than he had felt at any point since his return to Ravenscourt, understanding now, with painful clarity, that Eleanor had constructed her plan with a thoroughness that left him almost no viable path forward. Fighting her legally would mean exposing his own conduct publicly, in a courtroom, with all the accompanying scandal and damage to the family name that he had claimed, throughout the entire ordeal, to care so deeply about protecting. He found Celine in the blue room later that afternoon, packing a small case with methodical, deliberate movements that immediately caught his attention. "What are you doing?" he asked, standing in the doorway. Celine did not look up immediately, continuing to fold a dress carefully before setting it into the case. "I think it's time I returned to the city for a while, Alistair. I need some space to think about my own situation. given everything that's happening here. You're leaving, he said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice now, the recognition that even this, the one thing he had believed remained solidly his throughout the entire ordeal, might also be slipping away. I'm not leaving you, Celine said, finally looking up at him, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of genuine affection and careful self-preservation. I simply need to understand what my future actually looks like before I commit any further to a life here that seems, more each day, far less secure than you originally promised me it would be. Eleanor's plan has nothing to do with you, Alistair said, though even as he said it, he understood how little truth the statement actually contained. It has everything to do with me, Celine said gently. You've lost control over nearly every significant asset this family holds, Alistair. Whatever future you imagined for us together depended, in large part, on resources you no longer control. I care for you, I do, but I also need to think practically about my own life, and I cannot do that clearly while remaining in a house where every conversation seems to carry consequences I don't fully understand. Alistair had no response to this that felt adequate, and he watched, feeling more powerless than he had ever felt in his life, as Celine finished packing her case and arranged for a car to take her to the train station that same afternoon. She kissed him gently before leaving, promised to write, promised to think carefully about everything, but something in her voice as she said these things told him, even as he heard them, that her departure carried within it something more final than she was willing to say directly. He watched her car disappear down the long drive, and then he stood alone on the front steps of Ravenscourt for a long time afterward, in almost the exact spot where, weeks earlier, he had stood beaming with confidence, believing his return home would unfold exactly as he had planned it. Believing his wife would eventually accept an arrangement he had never bothered to fully explain to her, believing the woman on his arm would remain there indefinitely, secure in whatever future he vaguely promised her. None of it had unfolded as he expected. Eleanor had never once raised her voice, had never once created a public scene, had never given him a single moment where he could point to her behavior and claim she had behaved unreasonably. And yet, somehow, methodically and completely, she had dismantled every advantage he believed he possessed when he first walked through that door with Celine at his side. He returned inside eventually, walking slowly through the halls of a house that suddenly felt less familiar than it ever had before, and found Eleanor in her study, exactly where he expected to find her, reviewing papers at her desk with the same calm focus she brought to everything. Celine has left, he said, standing in the doorway. I heard the car, Eleanor said, not looking up from her papers. I'm sorry, Alistair, if that causes you pain. I never wished for anyone to suffer through this, including her. Did you plan this too? He asked, and there was less accusation in his voice now than there had been the previous evening, something closer to exhausted curiosity. Her leaving. Eleanor finally set down her pen and looked up at him, her expression carrying something almost gentle, though the steadiness beneath it remained entirely unchanged. I plan to protect what belongs to this family. I offered Celine some honest advice, weeks ago, about the importance of securing her own future rather than relying entirely on promises. Whatever she chose to do with that advice was entirely her own decision, Alistair. I did not orchestrate her departure. I simply gave her the same clarity I have been trying, in my own way, to give you. Alistair sat down heavily in the chair across from her desk, the same chair he had occupied countless times over the years for routine conversations about household matters, feeling now as though he were seated in an entirely different room, facing an entirely different woman than the wife he believed he had known for 20 years. I don't understand you anymore, he said quietly. Perhaps, Eleanor said, you never fully understood me at all, Alistair. Perhaps you understood only the version of me that was convenient for you, the one who managed the household quietly and asked few difficult questions, and never considered that woman might also be capable of protecting herself, thoroughly and completely, once she understood she needed to. He had no answer for this, because he suspected, uncomfortably, that she was entirely correct, and the silence between them stretched on for a long moment before Eleanor spoke again, her voice softening slightly, though nothing in her resolve wavered. There is still one document remaining, Alistair. I am not yet finished. When it is ready, we will need to discuss it together, and you will need to decide how you wish to proceed from there. I would advise you to spend the coming days considering carefully what you actually want your future to look like, because the choices ahead of you will determine that future, far more significantly than anything that has happened so far. Alistair left the study without responding, walking slowly back through the quiet halls of Ravenscourt, understanding, with a clarity that had eluded him for weeks, that whatever remained of his old life, the confident, careless existence he had enjoyed before that ordinary Tuesday evening a year ago, when Eleanor first noticed a small discrepancy in the household accounts, was already gone, and would not be returning, regardless of what he decided to do next. 10 days after Celine's departure, Mr. Colton returned to Ravenscourt, carrying a single document in his leather case, and Eleanor received him in her study with the same quiet composure she had maintained throughout the entire year of careful preparation that had led to this moment. "This is the final one," Colton said, laying the document carefully on her desk. "Everything you requested is included. The full settlement terms, the division of remaining assets, and the formal dissolution of the marriage. I've reviewed it thoroughly. It is entirely sound, legally speaking, and heavily favorable to your position, given everything that has already been established through the previous documents." Eleanor read through the pages slowly, carefully, taking her time despite having reviewed earlier drafts of nearly every clause over the preceding weeks. The terms were, as Colton had said, considerably favorable to her. She would retain full control of the family trust, the majority of the business investments, and Ravenscourt itself would remain under her ownership and management, with Alistair retaining only the title itself and a modest personal allowance, sufficient to maintain a comfortable but significantly reduced standard of living, along with a smaller property in the countryside that had belonged to his own mother before her passing. "He will not be left destitute," Eleanor said, more to herself than to Colton, tracing her finger along the relevant clause. "I did not want that. Whatever he has done, he is still the father of decisions we made together, still connected to this family's history, in ways I cannot simply erase." "That's a generous consideration," Colton said, "given everything he has cost you." "Generosity is not weakness, Mr. Colton," Eleanor said, closing the document and setting it carefully on the corner of her desk. "I want to walk away from this having behaved with integrity, regardless of how he chose to behave. That matters to me, perhaps more than it should." Colton nodded, understanding, and departed shortly after, leaving Eleanor alone with the final document that represented the culmination of a year's careful, patient work. She found Alistair that evening in the small library, seated near the window, exactly as he had been the day she brought him the first document weeks earlier, though he looked considerably changed since that afternoon, thinner somehow, the easy confidence that had once defined him entirely absent from his posture. "There is something we need to discuss," Eleanor said, setting the document on the small table beside him, exactly as she had done so many times before over the preceding weeks. Alistair looked at the papers with visible apprehension, understanding immediately, from the thickness of the document and the careful gravity in Eleanor's expression, that this was not another routine administrative matter. "This is the final one, isn't it? The one you mentioned?" "Yes," Eleanor said, sitting down across from him rather than standing, wanting, for this particular conversation, to meet him as an equal, rather than deliver news from a position of distance. "This document formalizes our divorce, Alistair, and settles the division of remaining assets between us." He picked up the papers slowly, reading through them with the same close attention he had failed to give every previous document, understanding now, far too late, exactly what careful reading might have spared him weeks earlier. He read the terms carefully, his expression shifting through several stages of understanding, as he moved from page to page, finally reaching the settlement details near the end. "You've left me the title," he said quietly, looking up at her, "and a small allowance. And your mother's countryside house." "My mother-in-law's house," Eleanor corrected gently. "Yes, I did not want you left with nothing, Alistair. Whatever has happened between us. But you should understand clearly that this represents a significant reduction from everything you once controlled. The trust, the primary business investments, Ravenscourt itself, these will remain under my authority going forward." Alistair set the document down slowly, staring at it for a long moment before finally speaking again, his voice carrying none of its earlier anger, only a kind of tired, resigned understanding. "You could have taken everything, Eleanor. Given what I did, given how thoroughly you outmaneuvered me these past weeks, you could have left me with nothing at all, and any court in the country would have understood why. I could have, Eleanor agreed. I considered it, in my angrier moments this past year, but I decided, eventually, that I did not want to build my future on the foundation of complete ruin for someone I once loved as deeply as I loved you. I want fairness, Alistair, not destruction. There is a difference, even if it may not always feel that way to you. He was quiet for a long moment, turning the pages over again, reading through certain clauses more carefully, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried something almost like genuine humility, an emotion Eleanor had rarely heard from him during their 20 years together. I don't know what to say to you. I have spent weeks angry at what you did, feeling betrayed by your silence, by your patience, by your willingness to let me sign away everything without warning me directly. But sitting here now, looking at these terms, I understand that you have been more fair to me than I was ever fair to you. I appreciate you saying that, Eleanor said quietly. Though I don't need your understanding to move forward with this, Alistair. I have already decided what I intend to do, regardless of how you respond. But I would prefer, if possible, that we conclude this matter with some measure of the dignity we both deserve, rather than continued anger between us. What happens if I refuse to sign? Alistair asked, though the question carried little real defiance, more simple curiosity about the practical consequences of a path he had already, in his heart, decided against. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. If you refuse, I will pursue this through the courts instead, and I will bring with me every piece of evidence I have gathered this past year, the transfers, the accounts, the pattern of deception stretching back well before your departure 8 months ago. A public proceeding of that nature would likely cost you considerably more than what is currently offered here, both financially and in terms of your reputation, which, as you well know, has always mattered a great deal to you. I would prefer not to pursue that path, Alistair, but I am entirely prepared to, if it becomes necessary. Alistair sat with this understanding for a long moment, the full weight of his situation finally settling completely, and when he finally spoke again, there was nothing left of the confident man who had walked through the front doors of Ravenscourt smiling, weeks earlier, believing he controlled every aspect of the life still ahead of him. I need some time to consider this properly, he said. Not to negotiate. I understand there is little room for that now. Simply to accept what has happened, fully, before I put my name to it. Take whatever time you need, Eleanor said, rising from her chair. The document will be here whenever you're ready. There is no urgency on my part, Alistair, beyond wanting this matter finally properly resolved. She left him alone in the small library with the papers spread across his lap, the same room where their marriage had, in a practical sense, finally come to its formal end, though the actual signature that would complete it still remained, for now, unwritten. Waiting for Alistair to find within himself whatever remained of the honesty and dignity Eleanor had asked him, gently but firmly, to bring to their final conversation together. 3 days passed before Alistair sought Eleanor out again, and in that time, the household at Ravenscourt settled into a quiet, uncertain rhythm, the staff moving carefully around a master who spent most of his hours alone, walking the garden path slowly, sitting in his study without any of the correspondence or business matters that had once filled his days, seemingly lost in a reflection he had avoided for most of his adult life. During those same 3 days, a letter arrived from Celine, brief and carefully worded, informing Alistair that she had decided to remain in the city, that she had accepted a position with a design firm she had been quietly corresponding with for several weeks, and that she believed, given everything that had happened, it would be best for both of them to consider their relationship concluded. She wished him well, she wrote, and thanked him sincerely for the months they had shared together, but she had come to understand, through recent events, that she needed to build her own security, rather than depend on promises that circumstances could so easily unravel. Alistair read the letter twice, and then set it aside, without any visible reaction, beyond a quiet, resigned sigh, understanding that this particular loss, though it might once have devastated him, now felt almost inevitable, given everything else that had already fallen away around him. On the third evening, he found Eleanor in her study, exactly where he expected to find her, and he entered without knocking, closing the door quietly behind him, before crossing to her desk and setting the divorce settlement down between them, along with a pen he had brought from his own study. "I've made my decision," he said. Eleanor set down the book she had been reading and looked up at him, her expression carrying a careful, watchful patience, giving nothing away about her own feelings in this final moment. "And what have you decided?" "I'm going to sign it," Alistair said. "Not because I feel I have no other choice, though I understand that is largely true, but because, sitting alone these past 3 days, I have finally allowed myself to understand fully what my choices have cost, not just financially, but in terms of the trust and respect I once had from the person who knew me better than anyone else in the world. I don't deserve your fairness, Eleanor. I understand that clearly now, but I intend to accept it with whatever grace I still have left to offer." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for any trace of manipulation, any lingering attempt to win back something he no longer had any right to claim, and finding, to her quiet surprise, only genuine, exhausted honesty. "Celine wrote to you," she said, not quite a question. "Yes," Alistair said. "She's remaining in the city. She's found her own path forward, it seems. One that doesn't require relying on promises I was never truly in a position to keep." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, and there was genuine sympathy in her voice, surprising even herself with how easily it came. "Truly, Alistair, whatever has happened between us, I never wished for you to end up entirely alone." "I'm not entirely alone," he said. "I still have the title, your mother-in-law's house, a modest allowance, more than I deserve, given everything I've done." He paused, looking down at the document between them. "I only wish I had understood, months ago, what I stood to lose, before I so carelessly threw it all away." Eleanor rose from her desk and stood beside him as he sat down in the chair across from it, picking up the pen and turning to the final page where his signature was required to complete the settlement. He held the pen above the line for a long moment, and Eleanor watched him with an expression that carried, finally, after everything, something close to genuine peace, rather than the careful strategic patience she had maintained for so many months. "Before I sign this," Alistair said, looking up at her one final time, "I want you to know that whatever anger I felt these past weeks has passed. I understand what you did, and why you did it, and I understand that I gave you no other honest path forward. You built something remarkable out of the wreckage I created, Eleanor. I hope you find genuine happiness with whatever comes next, entirely separate from anything connected to me." "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly. "I intend to." He signed his name at the bottom of the final page, the same signature he had used for 20 years, though this time, his hand moved more slowly, more deliberately, carrying the full weight of everything the signature represented, rather than the careless confidence with which he had signed every previous document during his return home. When he finished, he set the pen down and looked at the completed document for a long moment before finally rising from the chair. "I'll arrange to move to the countryside house within the month, if that suits you." "Take whatever time you need," Eleanor said. "There is no urgency now that this is settled." He nodded and turned to leave the study, pausing briefly at the door to look back at her one final time. "Goodbye, Eleanor. I mean that with more genuine respect than I've shown you in longer than I care to admit." "Goodbye, Alistair," she said, and there was warmth in her voice, real and unforced, the warmth of a woman finally, completely free from a chapter of her life that had cost her a great deal, but had also, in the end, revealed a strength within herself she had never fully known she possessed. He left the room, and Eleanor stood alone for a long moment afterward, holding the completed settlement in her hands, feeling something settle within her that she could only describe as a quiet, complete sense of closure, the kind that comes not from anger finally released, but from a difficult chapter finally, properly finished. She called Mr. Colton the following morning to finalize the paperwork, and within a few weeks, the formal transition was complete. Alistair moved to the small countryside house that had once belonged to his mother, living quietly and modestly, occasionally sending brief, polite letters that Eleanor read with genuine warmth, rather than any lingering bitterness. Celine, true to her letter, remained in the city, building a career of her own that, in time, brought her a measure of success and independence she had never fully possessed during her months at Ravenscourt. Eleanor remained at Ravenscourt, managing the estate with the same steady competence she always had, though now with a confidence and authority that had grown considerably over the past year of careful, patient work. The staff, who had once addressed her simply as the Duke's wife, began, gradually and naturally, to speak of her differently, with a respect that recognized her not merely as an extension of her husband's title, but as a formidable presence entirely in her own right. On a quiet evening some months later, Eleanor walked alone through the garden path, where, so many years before, a much younger Alistair had knelt and promised her a lifetime of devotion, a promise that had, in the end, proven far more fragile than either of them could have imagined on that golden afternoon. She paused there for a moment, remembering that younger version of herself, full of hope and certainty, and she found, to her quiet satisfaction, that she felt no bitterness toward the memory, only a gentle, distant fondness for a chapter of her life that had ended, and a genuine gratitude for the strength and clarity that had carried her through everything that followed. She continued her walk through the garden, the evening light settling softly over Ravenscourt, her home, entirely her own now, in every sense that mattered, and as she walked, she allowed herself, finally, to look forward rather than back, toward a future she had built for herself, with patience, with careful determination, and with a quiet, unshakable strength that no one, not even the husband who had once believed he knew her completely, had ever fully understood she possessed.